One of the things we know about borderline is that there often can be a very significant history of trauma in a borderline childhood. Now, borderline also has a component that can very much be also genetic, and we know that this sort of combination of genetics and environment in the right situations can definitely lend itself to creating a borderline PD in a human being. Now, because we have a lot of trauma in borderline, and because complex PTSD is all about trauma, oftentimes in a childhood, I thought it would be good to just describe the differences between BPD and CPTSD using the examples of, let's say a parent has borderline and their adult child has complex PTSD as a result of the parenting from the borderline, and or perhaps in addition to that, something also happened that created repetitive trauma from which escape was unlikely. All right, and so that's how I'm going to break it down. And so I'm first going to talk about quickly describing each of these different dynamics, how we see BPD and CPTSD. Then I'm going to describe how they are similar, and then using the example of, let's say, a parent has BPD and an adult child has CPTSD, what it would look like in real life. Before I get started, I'm Dr. Kim Sage. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll consider subscribing and clicking the bell, and that way you'll get notified when I post new videos. As always, my goal with these videos is to talk about attachment and relationships and trauma, and really to help people who may not understand how their childhoods were affected by certain parenting dynamics, or how their relationships are affected, or just how to understand ourselves better in different ways using media and teachings and whatever I hope you guys will find helpful. All right, so just quickly to review, borderline PD is a pervasive mental illness that really affects interpersonal relationships and mood and behavior. The core is really about an unstable sense of self, relational instability, emotional dysregulation, and that can really play out in a bunch of different ways. So we're going to see difficulty regulating emotions, impulsivity, acting out of behaviors, thought patterns that really are driven by an unstable and oftentimes not factual belief system about the way the world works. And the core of borderline is really about this fear of abandonment. And everything is sort of derived from oftentimes, a lower sense of self with shame and guilt and not being worthy, and like, I knew you were going to leave me kind of dynamic, and so I go out in the world, but then I end up recreating that, right? So the core is this wound about the sense of self, and it manifests in really chaotic and dramatic and unstable relationships and emotions and experiences, all over the map. Now, complex PTSD at the core, keeping in mind that borderline often does have a lot of trauma associated with it, and often if we think about borderline coming out of a disorganized attachment story, there's obviously going to be trauma there too. But to have CPTSD, you must have an exposure to often a chronic or prolonged trauma, often in childhood, often from which things are preventing you from escaping, like enduring a difficult home. It can also be from, ongoing chronic severe sexual, mental, emotional abuse, captivity, all kinds of things. But in this video, I'm going to use it to describe sort of how we might look at a person's life if that's, let's say they have CPTSD as a result of BPD parenting and or an additional trauma that occurred often in childhood. We often think of CPTSD as a shame-based disorder, which really is a result of this long-term and chronic exposure. Unlike PTSD, which is more of a fear-based disorder as we think about it, the hallmark of CPTSD is often this core sense of defectiveness, of shame, of even in many regards, I am bad, as I made in this video. And so you can see that because of how the sense of self is so negative at times and wounded, there is a lot of overlap between CPTSD and BPD. And so where we see similarities are really in their affective patterns in terms of emotion. So we're going to see a lot of emotional distress, a lot of emotional triggers. They can both have dissociation and suicidality and suicidal tendencies, although it's much more likely with borderline. They can often have anxiety and depression, both of them. They both can struggle with negative self-concept, have difficulty regulating emotions, have outbursts of crying or rage or fear. They can definitely have interpersonal issues that can kind of cross over clearly, because if your core is I am bad or you're going to leave me, that's going to show up in how we engage in relationships one way or another, because there's not a sense of trust and safety and security in the self and in the ability to navigate emotional triggers. Now, you can be diagnosed with both, although we tend to want to sort of figure out what's the root of what's going on in terms of treatment, because the treatment programs can be very different. And we want to make sure we get that straight. And that's why I think it's so important to talk about, because they can look similar, and yet at the core, they do have a different, I believe, root. The trees and the roots of each one are very different. And when we're working with clients in this area, we want to make sure we're getting it right, because if we're treating just trauma versus treating, a personality disorder, we often can end up in the wrong department altogether and actually make the person's difficulties worse, and we don't want to do that. So I am not a big fan of labeling at all, but I do believe that giving us obviously a diagnosis gives us a treatment plan, and that is where it matters. And so I'll talk a little bit about treatment and how it's different at the end of this video. All right, so let's assume that we have a mom or dad with borderline, and we have an adult child with CPTSD. What is it going to look like? So let's say that we're just going to call her mom and we'll just call her daughter. All right, now I might interchange dad and son, but remember that this disorder in borderline and complex PTSD, it does not discriminate, although we're often diagnosing women more with borderline, and often more women come into therapy, so there's probably more walking around with both of these labels. But the truth is that it can apply to anyone, all right? So let's go through each category of where they're different. When we think about mom or dad with borderline, what we are seeing is that the root of borderline is a fear of abandonment. It is a fear that you will leave me. And in an adult child with CPTSD, the fear isn't so much of abandonment, it's of relationships altogether. Why? Because mom or dad or both weren't safe. Therefore, people aren't safe. So I'm not really going to trust relationships if I have CPTSD from the fact that it's not so much I'm afraid you're going to leave me, it's that I can't trust you altogether to be there for me, to give me what I need, to be a safe source of support and security and stability. So I like to think of it as borderline is scanning for abandonment at any moment. Are you going to leave me? Why don't you think I'm good enough? And those with CPTSD are scanning for a lack of safety. Because of the core, we need to feel safety in order to feel trust. So because CPTSD is about this hyperactivation of our arousal system, our nervous system, I believe that the scan in borderline is for abandonment, and the scan in CPTSD is for, do I need to go into fight or flight or freeze or fawn? I am activated all the time scanning for security and safety to then decide what I'm going to do to protect myself. So you can imagine with a borderline parent who is always accusing you or coming after you or being emotionally abusive or upset with you, that you've learned that I have to be on hyper alert all of the time, because I know when dad comes in the door from work, that's a bad time. Or I know on the weekend if I disrupt him, or if he thinks I'm insulting him at the dinner table, that's a bad time, right? So I'm scanning and assessing for safety and being alert, borderline scanning for abandonment. So I always think of also borderline is about fear of leaving you is the wound. And for CPTSD, let's say daughter or son, relationships, you are the wound. Anybody who can be safe is the wound. People are the wound. They can burn you at any moment. And so you must always be prepared for that. Now, borderline feels that way too, but it's going to look a little different. Now, as a result of that, borderline rage and anger are going to be much more significant than a CPTSD rage or anger. Yes, we can have them. They're sort of these out-of-body experiences at times where the person is triggered. In that sense, they both can have an overlap. But you don't tend to see a vindictive nature to CPTSD. They might lose control, but they're not, filled with that hatred and rage so much that goes outward. They are more likely to turn that inward. And it's all about, I am bad, I am defective. And so the rage part can happen in the moment, but it's not so much about this intention to wound and strike back in the way that it can be with a borderline, let's say, parent. Now, let's say mom is the borderline or dad, right? So at the core, they have this unstable self-image. Who am I? It can be sort of chameleon-like. It can be always changing. It can be difficult to have them understand that you can change too. They like things to be a certain way, and they're always trying to create identity in terms of like, who are they? Well, with CPTSD, let's say a child, adult child, we know who we are, let's say if we have this, but we think we're bad, right? So it's not about I don't know who I am, it's about who I am is shameful and defective and bad and wrong because, let's say as a result of the borderline parent, you told me I was bad and wrong and horrible, and you showed me through your unstable behavior that human beings are not safe and that I need to protect myself at all times. And whereas the borderline is like, well, I don't really know who I am, that could change minute by minute, day by day, hour by hour. Both can definitely dissociate, although I believe that for the borderline, it often happens as they go into these emotional phases where they feel triggered by the abandonment or by the wound. And I think for dissociation for CPTSD, it can often be triggered by, reliving the trauma or having a trauma trigger occur. Now, we can see this sort of criticalness that occurs in both, but I think at the outward part for the borderline is that the criticalness, although there is a deep defective sense of self, will often see it manifested in criticizing others, whereas I believe that the inner and outer critic that exists in CPTSD is more likely to be directed on ourselves. Yes, we can be critical of others and not trusting, but the person we're the most critical of is ourselves, and we don't feel safe anywhere. And so we're always sort of manifesting this sense of like, I need to protect myself. So when it comes to things like suicide, for a borderline, it's much more likely to be someone who's a borderline parent who will be cutting or engaging in risky behaviors, addictions, substances, intending to actually hurt themselves in a moment of being triggered in rage. Now, we don't really see that so much with CPTSD. We can definitely see suicidal ideation and flashbacks and all of that, but I would say that the risk for completion of suicide or serious attempts is going to be much higher with BPD as a result of that, like them feeling rejected and no one loves me and I don't matter. Whereas for a trauma victim, it may be like, I just can't live this way anymore. I'll never get better. And so that feels like a safer way out. When it comes to relationships, let's say a borderline parent, they don't necessarily want to be alone. And so they may struggle with loneliness and needing to find someone to fill the space. So let's say that they might engage in an affair, or they might be a single parent, but not for long. They really do they need to use relationships to deal with that loneliness and that deep sense of longing and that fear of being left. Whereas for somebody who has CPTSD, let's say an adult child, they are really more likely to avoid relationships because at the core they feel unsafe, they can't trust them, or that they feel unlovable. No one will really love them for who they are. As a result of all the trauma they've endured or the experiences they've had thrown at them, let's say through an abusive borderline parent, at the core they believe there's no sense of value and trustworthiness. And so I'm just going to avoid humans and relationships altogether. Whereas a borderline might go in and out of relationships trying to always fill that deep sense of isolation and loneliness or fear of being left by filling it up with relationships. Those who have CPTSD are more likely to avoid relationships altogether, and or as soon as they get emotional or attached, to sort of have to extricate themselves because it feels too triggering and too vulnerable and too unsafe. Also, as I said before, we will often see a lot of substance use, addictions, eating disorders, gambling, compulsive behavior in borderline parents, let's say, whereas that same need to have a substance for a CPTSD adult child might be more about needing to numb out and to quell the flashbacks, the trauma, the lack of worthiness inside. And so the both can use substances, but I think the reason why they do it can differ a little bit. There is obviously overlap. There's a lot of overlap in these issues in general, but there's a numbness inside that is often just desperately needing to be kept maintained for CPTSD. And I think with borderline, there's more of this high and low in the feelings. Those that have CPTSD would much rather just not feel anything because they're so overwhelmed and flooded by their feelings, and they're less likely to act out in the same way to deal with that like a borderline might. So at the core, we have a borderline, let's say, who got it from her own childhood, who also had the genetic predisposition, let's say. And borderlines often do have a lot of trauma, so there could be trauma there. But let's say the child, as I'm discussing, did not, they may have some traits of borderline, but at the core, they're not having that disorder, but they do have this trauma, this repetitive trauma from the parent who was always yelling, always unstable, abusive, name-calling, verbally abusive, unsafe at the core. That really heart of disorganized attachment is manifested in not only a trauma from the parent and how they parented, but perhaps from the situations the borderline parent put them in through other child caregivers, through shipping them off somewhere, through through leaving them with other caregivers, through being absent or disengaged or dissociating, right? And so you can see how they can be so similar, and yet when we talk about treatment, the treatments are going to be very different. So if someone has basically a BPD diagnosis, we're going to really work on decreasing dependency on others, managing and navigating, creating a more stable sense of self, holding the self accountable, learning how to make repairs, working on emotional dysregulation, relational instability, helping them create more, wholeness and stability in how they engage with themselves and the world. And clearly want to help them avoid these risky behaviors of self-harm or suicidality. Now with CPTSD, we want to really work on dealing with this avoidance strategy, avoidance of social situations, of people, creating and fostering healthier relational dynamics of attachment, security, and safety. We want to work on creating a positive self-concept that isn't about I am bad, but about I'm a survivor, I am strong. We want to restore a sense of power and well-being and control. Let's say, for example, with CPTSD, we're really going to work on repairing and recreating and rebuilding the foundation of the sense of self, how to manage triggers, how to engage in the world in a safer way. And that's going to be different from trying to navigate and manage these tendencies that are sort of self-destructive at the root of borderline, because they really do. They become just sabotaging behaviors, emotions, thoughts, actions, relationship issues that tend to push people away, but they really don't want to be pushed away. And oftentimes that root of not being lost and rejected will force them into treatment when they finally do lose their adult children, when they stop speaking to them and things like that. And or they won't get treated and it will just stay in their mind that like it was all your fault anyway. But that's very different from somebody who at the core believes, as a result of repeated trauma, let's say in parenting, that I am bad, I am defective, no one is safe, I should avoid relationships, I should numb, and I have no power over my own life. Those are going to be very different treatment plans. All right, so I hope this was helpful. I hope it gives you just some glimpse into these two different issues and how they can overlap, how they can be similar, but why it really matters. And I do think it's important to understand that it is very likely that those of you who are watching these videos who have shared your stories, that if you have not developed borderline in yourself, that you may have CPTSD from a borderline parent or a narcissistic parent or any abusive parent or any toxic parent. Clearly, it also applies to those who have had other types of abuse as well, from sexual, physical, emotional abuse. And the idea of all of this is that if you understand what's going on, if you understand your wounds, your story, even your own things you need to repair, regardless of whatever you believe you or someone else might have, that is the only way to begin to change and heal it. Because if we don't know what it is, we cannot begin to figure out how to heal it and treat it. So I hope you will know that you are worthy of love and healing and belonging, whether you have BPD or BPD traits, or you are the victim of a story of a borderline or abusive toxic parent, or you are thinking to yourself, yeah, I am actually doing this to my child. I need to get help to stop it. And it's never too late to start to heal your life. It really isn't. People can feel like, well, there's no way to get past it. I've created so much chaos for my adult child. They'll never speak to me again, and they may never speak to you again. But at the core, I truly believe we want to be healed and whole. We want to love our parents. We want them to love us and be safe. And you might be amazed at what a lot of work and a lot of repair can do for your life. And so whatever happens, if it also means that you can't talk to that parent to protect yourself, then you should not feel guilty about doing that. You had no chance to protect yourself as a child, but you do today. And so I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Please stay safe and well. And don't forget to subscribe and click the bell. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And I will see you next time. Bye guys. Thanks so much for watching.